I am Julia Dolan, the Minor White Curator of Photography, and I am so pleased to welcome you to the Portland Art Museum for what is sure to be a very special afternoon with Emmet Gowin. Before I introduce Emmet, I would like to take a moment to recognize a number of generous individuals who have helped make this lecture and our overall photography program not only possible, but vibrant and meaningful as well. First and foremost, I am grateful to the Arnold and Augusta Newman Foundation for sponsoring this distinguished lecture program. In 2013, the foundation supported a lecture by Carrie Mae Weems, and last year's distinguished speaker was Richard Moss. Arnold and Augusta's son David and David's wife Deirdre are here with us today. David, many, many thanks to you and to your family's foundation for supporting this special lecture series. I am always grateful to the many members of the Photography Council who support many photographic endeavors each year at the museum. Many thanks to Jim and Susan Winkler, as well as Chris Rauschenberg and Janet Stein, who are also with us today and who consistently support the museum's photography program. A special thank you goes out to Will Thornton, who last year donated 2 of Emmet's prints to the museum's collection, single-handedly tripling our collection of Emmet's work. Emmet, I promise we will work on that. I'm going to try to get a few more into the collection before the exhibition is over. Finally, I would like to thank Edith Gowin. I've come to know you through Emmet's photographs, but spending time with you in person these past few days is even more special than I imagined. Now, on to Emmet Gowin. Emmet is Professor Emeritus at Princeton University, where he taught for 36 years before retiring in 2010. Emmet worked with Harry Callahan at the Rhode Island School of Design, where he received his MFA in photography in 1967. He has had monographic exhibitions at many august institutions, including the Museum of Modern Art, the Philadelphia Museum of Art, the Corcoran Gallery of Art, the Tokyo Museum of Art, and most recently at Fondation Mapfre and the Morgan Library and Museum. Emmet's photographs have been collected by museums throughout the world. He is the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship, 2 National Endowment for the Arts Fellowships, the Governor's Award for Excellence in the Arts from the state of Pennsylvania, and in 1997, Princeton awarded him the President's Award for Distinguished Teaching. Please join me in welcoming our 2015 Newman Distinguished Lecturer in Photography, Emmet Gowin.
Well, good afternoon a second time. First, let me congratulate you for living in such a beautiful city. What a wise decision. And for having such a wonderful and beautiful museum. And for having such a fine and intelligent curator of photography in Julia Dolan. Well, my project for this afternoon is Julia and I made the decision that I would more or less try to go over the same territory that I went over when I left Princeton in the fall of 2009, 2010. I did a parting lecture, and that's our job this afternoon. But a little time has gone by and some things have happened in our lives, and the hour that I always speak of is Edith and myself. And this summer, the small museum in Danville, Virginia, honored Edith and I by, I can hardly bring the words across my lips, inducting us into their Hall of Fame. Now, this is the little museum that is the house in which the cabinet and the president of the Confederacy spent their last 4 days before Lee surrendered. So it's a very strange situation. Now, when I was a child, that was the public library. Overtones of Lee's surrender were far from our young minds. But I was able to convince them that something like a lifetime achievement in the arts was a more delicious sounding title than Hall of Fame. And when they insisted that we produce a contemporary picture of ourselves for this installation, we both unanimously said, "Oh no." And this has nothing to do with personal vanity, I can assure you. I suppose we have a little of that, but not that much. What we wanted to do and what I wanted to say to you this afternoon, I wanted to begin by reflecting back on who we were as 28, 27-year-olds. In 1968, just finished with graduate school and, in a way, on our own for the first time. A less than 1-year-old child in the family. And we insisted to the people in Danville that it's who we were at that moment, the audacious faith we had in what we were doing. Without that, there wouldn't be a now. Now, if you change the image, please. And Julia mentioned this. As one of the greatest experiences of our lives is to work with a curator at the Morgan Library and Museum in New York over this last year and a half and produce an exhibition that was on there all of this past summer. And the real instance that I'm trying to conjure is the space between 1968 and this summer. And of course, what you accomplish and do and what you think over a period of time, as much as 52 years, well, you change. Now, if you can give us the PDF now, we'll start. And I'd like to do this in a kind of chronological order, going back to when I was a high school student in Danville, Virginia. We just moved from Chincoteague Island off the coast of Virginia, a place that has still an important part in my education. I'm heavily supporting this recent documentary on the biologist Edward Wilson, of Ants and Men. And as I watched this documentary, I could see in his childhood many things that I experienced in my own. That feeling that education just interfered with your education. No Child Left Behind is just the opposite of the effect we wanted. We wanted to be left behind. We wanted to be left alone and to be on our own and to be experiencing nature for ourselves. And it's just when we've moved to Danville, Virginia in 1957, I was waiting for a dentist and came across this picture in a photo magazine. Unconscious of what I was saying or thinking, just out of nowhere came the words, "This is another Christ. This is a resurrection." And it's a resurrection that we all know something about. Not to belittle or change the resurrection that the Scripture holds so precious, but to reinvent our connectedness to resurrections which are taking place all the time. I went home that evening. I asked my father for the family camera, not something he let me take very easily, and I carried that camera for several months until I actually found my own version of the grass and the burned tree and replicated the picture as closely as I could. And I gave the camera back and I thought, well, that's a fine career in photography. That was great. And finished high school, went to business school for a couple of years, which was nothing but a kind of a smokescreen, a kind of diversion to keep my parents, who were fundamentalist and devoutly religious, had expected me to read my Bible on a daily basis as a teen, which I did without complaint. But in 1961, started at Richmond Professional Institute, which is now Virginia Commonwealth University. And I started making pictures like this. And the reason I started making pictures like this is because I had seen great photographs by my peers, by Henri Cartier-Bresson, by Robert Frank, by Walker Evans. And I was trying to locate myself within a tradition of American photography. About this time, there's little stories, and there's a story I promised the dinner conversation last night. Waiting for Edith to change her dress one afternoon late. We were going out for something, and I was standing in the driveway, and it was one of those earthen driveways where a small pool of water had collected, and I was just standing there peering down into the pool of water. I knew it was shallow, but there was something about the way it looked that suggested that it could pass through to the other side of the earth. And I did this little mental experiment, which is an experiment located inside this rich desire to experience everything, to circumnavigate the world, to be educated through experience, to gain discipline out of your own experience. And I thought, what would it be like if I could pass through that pool of water and come out exactly on the other side of the world? And having done that in my mind for a few seconds, I'd come up in a very exotic place. But the converse of that situation also occurred to me, that someone passing through on that line would come out in the place that I had just vacated, which was Danville, Virginia, which in my mind of that time was a very commonplace location in the world. And this little mental experiment remade my relationship to the world. I realized that my Virginia was as strange as if I had landed in New Guinea. I was a new person having come through the earth to the other side, or circling around. And when you say it that way, what's the furthest distance you can go is to come back to where you're already standing. This galvanized me. This made me have a sense of my own family as being the most precious, the most accessible, the most important subject I could ever have. And this is a time when, in photography, one's family was something you simply concealed. It was relegated to the snapshot album. It was not a professional activity. At the end of 4 years in Virginia, we had a little project called the 100 Book Project, and I produced this as a book with 14 original photographs. My senior thesis, I thought of it as that. It wasn't my thesis technically, but 100 copies of this thing was really important to me. What I remember, and what I'm going to illustrate for you here, is that I had been influenced in a way that I could never have understood. In fact, it was 20 years before one of my professors, to whom I was very close, Jim Baumgartner, had heard me give this lecture and refer to the experience of coming home one evening from drawing class, finding a piece of graph paper on my desk, thinking, this is exactly what I need. I need a cover for my thesis. I'll sit down and I'll make a drawing. And anyone who knows the Family of Man album intimately will recognize there are a lot of little small quotes out of the Family of Man inside this drawing. And I've created a very liberated version of myself, able to fly, a camera in each hand. You don't know what you're doing. You can really only speak honestly to your mistakes, things that you didn't intend to do. So Jim Baumgartner, 20 years later, when he heard me tell this story, he said, I remember the afternoon when you saw the French edition of Robert Frank's The Americans in my studio. You studied it for a few minutes and put it down. Of course, I'd seen the book before, but I didn't remember ever having seen this cover. I can't talk to you about my life in photography without citing really important people, and Harry Callahan I'd put at the foremost of this list. It was a lifelong relationships once we knew each other. And there's a tenderness in Callahan that really astonished me. And a toughness, a gruffness, a straight to the point, Midwestern simplicity of terms. He'd introduced a very small group of graduate students to each other, and he said, "You guys become acquainted, and I'll be back in a minute." I was showing that graduate or that undergraduate thesis to my colleagues. Callahan sort of came up behind me as if he were nobody whatsoever, looked over my shoulder, and he said, "I wonder if you'll ever learn to print." He said, and the problem, the sadness of this is, I don't think we're smart enough to teach you. You're just going to have to figure it out on your own. Well, what a blunt and interesting way to get your point across. But Callahan was dear to me in all sorts of ways, and I began to assist him in teaching the intro courses at Rhode Island. A Callahan photo that stands in for the many, many, many that represent a level of intimacy and closeness, of darkness and security, of quietude that marks his work, that was so treasured and so important to me. During those 2 years in Rhode Island, I got to know this man, Walker Evans. My closest friend in graduate school was James Dow, who became Walker's printer from about 1969 on for about 5 or 6 years. And this is the first time I'd met Evans, and he was in the hallway of his East Side apartment. We were saying our goodbyes. I adored him immensely, but as I think about him now and I look at that sort of straightforward face, I mean, there's holding back of everything. You don't know what's behind that face. I'd asked him, was Lincoln Kirsten right? Had you seen Paris through the eyes of Eugene Atget? And he gave a very characteristic sort of gruff little answer. He said, well, Lincoln sometimes gets things wrong. I'm not sure he's absolutely right about that. And I knew that meant that was absolutely the truth, but with a little obfuscation thrown in. These two people, very different personalities, but had influenced me in complementary ways. The little photograph of the burned tree stump with the young grasses, that's an Ansel Adams photograph. Sierra Nevada, 1936, give or take a year or two. That got me going. It made me realize that an image could be symbolic, not simply a direct record. And the gentleman on your right, Frederick Sommer. Sommer and I connected before we ever met. And then when we met, the annealing process seemed almost instantaneous. I love the things that Sommer was saying. I love Callahan for his great working faith in the process of photography. But Sommer was saying things that, in a way, didn't so much mystify me, but galvanized me, made me feel so completely alive. Things like, we probably don't have a pure thought of our own. Only chance is fair. And then sort of secondary ideas. It's what you do every day in the simplest way that counts. The important thing is quality of attention span and to use it for acceptance rather than for negation. And when Callahan introduced me to Sommer, I had already been alerted to something through this picture, which I had discovered in the Rhode Island Library one evening, sitting in the stacks alone. And I had never experienced a photograph that took me on a direct connection to Leonardo da Vinci. But Leonardo and the Italian Renaissance was the real soul of what I was wanting to study and what I wanted to accomplish, what I saw as my part in life. And I've shown that photograph in situations where actually a few members of the audience have departed on the sight of that photograph. But you're all steely Northwesterners and made it through that with flying colors. Another soul important to me, the Kentucky artist Ralph Eugene Meatyard. I hope you can see that image well enough to see that there's a kind of prankster's air of levity in this picture. He's holding the nozzle of the garden hose to Edith's ear. A little bit like the arrow through the brain trick. Like I'm waiting for the stream of water to come out the other side. He had just days before been operated on and closed up with the doctor telling him, there's nothing we can do. You have a year, maybe, if you're lucky. Whenever I think of Gene, not only do I remember those peculiar and particular moments with him in person, but the beauty and power of his long-term influence. I checked myself out the other day because I had said this in public a few places, and I wanted to just be sure I had it right. And sure enough, I went to the back of one of the books on Meatyard, and there it was, a quotation from Cindy Sherman. She said, Ralph Eugene Meatyard is one of the few photographers who meant anything to me. And I had said this at Princeton. I'd said, it wouldn't have hurt her said that even more often and more loudly, because the relationship is a brilliant and wonderful relationship. Anyhow, he was an artist I simply adored. How many artists do you know who can fill a picture with light? It doesn't happen that often. Now, we've come ahead, but we have to back up to get the facts straight. In 1965, I just arrived in Rhode Island, been there a few weeks. We're just starting to help teach these intro courses, and I received my draft papers. The papers said, appear in North Carolina at such and such a base on such and such a day. And I called my draft board. Surely you know there's a mistake. I tried to explain to you I don't use guns, I don't shoot at people. There are just certain things that I'm not interested in doing. I know it was my mother's Quaker background, but they said, come to Virginia and we'll work it out. So I drove to Virginia, and as I was getting ready to leave, I turned to Callahan and I said, please can I borrow one of the school's cameras? I didn't have a 4x5 camera of my own. He set me up with a lens and a camera and a tripod. And then I realized I didn't have any film either. And I didn't have any holders to put the film in. And he now sort of smiling about the sort of the dumbness of it all. Dumb was a word he liked a lot. He would say that if it was really good, it was nifty, and if it was dumb, it was really dumb. And he said, oh, no problem, just come by my house on your way home. And he met me at the door with 5 film holders. And this caveat, there may be film in these holders. And if there is, because I didn't check, but if there is, it might be plus X, but it could be tri-X, or it could be something else. I'm not really sure what it is. And I laugh at myself. I laugh at telling you this, but I was so absorbed with the thought of saving my own life, of making sure that they understood in Virginia that shooting at people in Vietnam was just not my calling. And so I went home, never checking the holders to see if they were loaded at all, and with what. Never thought of it until the evening I'd come from the draft office and had my good conversation. Some children that I'd never met before, distant relatives, were in the yard playing with the children that I monitored and was very aware of. And I took a few pictures. And this little niece, watching all of this sort of very longingly, had pulled herself up in my lap that night. And she said, "Boy, you sure did take a lot of pictures of my cousin this afternoon." And I thought, well, yes. And she said, "Tomorrow I'm going to think of some really good things and you're going to take pictures of me all day." Well, of course, children forget things that they say like that. And I went to sleep and simply forgot it. Next morning, she pulled out a large box full of dolls and she said, "This is our first project." Well, now I was on the cusp of this problem. I wasn't at all sure there was film in the holder. And the sun was shining and there was nothing I could do but go ahead and pretend there was film in the camera. All of this leads back to Callahan. I stopped in Richmond on the way home and used the darkroom of one of my professors, developed the film. There was film. It was plus X. And it was a little less than a week when I was able to show Callahan a print. And he looked at it very soberly, the way he would when something was fresh to him. And he said, "Well, it looks like you've made your first picture." I mean, this was after 4 years of trying to be everybody else in the world and use the modalities which were the inspiration to all of my contemporaries. Well, that was a powerful benediction on a beginning. And I felt from that moment on that I had, in some way, in identifying my linkage to this family in Virginia and the importance of my wife, Edith, I'd found something that was maybe not a voice, but a true subject. It's not necessary to talk about all the pictures. In fact, I relish very much the real quietude in which the transfer really takes place. It's when you're sitting alone in solitude with a book of something that means something special to you. A transfer takes place that can never be transferred in words. This is a kind of surrogate experience. But every time I come to this, I remember that summer after leaving Callahan, and I still didn't have a teaching job, but that was more in the works than I realized at that point. But I also was processing my film week by week as I worked through that summer. And I felt like I'm not doing anything, I'm not getting anything. And one day, thinking to myself, "Oh, you're not making any progress," a story that Harry had told me came back. He said that Edward Steichen had called him from New York and said, "I'm passing through Chicago. Get your pictures ready. I want to see what you've been doing over the last year or so." And he said, I was so embarrassed, but I had to say, "Edward, I have one picture." And Steichen said, "Well, get it ready. I'm coming." And with that simplicity and on processing this particular film, I felt at the end of that summer, okay, I know what Callahan is talking about. You work really hard, and then at the end of it all, you say, okay, I have one picture. Something else was happening, and it's involved in all of these pictures made of the family. This is, well, you can never make up anything really new. In fact, you can't do anything new if you know what you're doing. These children had saved these turkeys from becoming Thanksgiving dinner because it was not permissible to terminate the lives of these turkeys until there was a proper photograph. And that was because I was a part of the family and proper photographs were what we did. In the detail of what's happening, there's something exquisitely wonderful. the children had arranged these 2 little buckets on the ground with the turkeys. But they had, after posing with the turkeys sitting on these buckets, they had said, okay, now we want to stand and hold the turkeys. And we had bound the legs of the turkeys with old cloth that had tied up tomato plants. And it must have been rotten because one of the turkeys struggled, and when it broke its feet free, it also swung its wings. And the boy has been flicked in the eye with this wing. So at the same moment, they're calling out to me, take the turkeys, put them on the ground. And I'm doing this job. I'm putting the turkeys on the ground. But as soon as I see they're clear of my need, I simply walk back to the camera, take the release in my hand, and push the shutter. I never look back. And probably for that very reason, that I was acting out of an impulse to not waste any time, take it now, but also because I hadn't looked back, I hadn't processed what the camera was seeing. And it's given me an uncommon faith in the idea that whatever is going on behind us, out of our sight, is probably just as important as whatever's in front of us. It's just that it's our habit to feature what is in front of us. What's back there matters too. That also is nature. That also is the glory of God's creation. It's simply not in front of us. It happens to be behind us. Well, I could go on because there's never really a new picture that the children didn't intervene. I think of this when I saw her make this gesture. She'd waited for me to come out from under the dark cloth. And when she had my eye, she crossed her arms. She had the 2 eggs, and she was going to tell me, soon enough, she was going to say, see what I found. See, isn't this a miracle? But she had embellished somehow out of a kind of body wisdom. Do something with yourself to make this sacred moment more powerful. This is the wisdom of the body. Joseph Campbell tells a really cute analogy for this situation. He says, if the grass were to give up, every week you go out and you mow the grass, and finally, after 6 or 7 weeks of this, the grass just says, oh, forget it, I give up. You get the feeling of this, and he says, this is the wisdom of the body, the wisdom of the grass. It does what it is in its nature to do. It's a wonderful chaos. It characterized, my story out of this is not so much this morning, which we reenact this story every Christmas. We still do. Mayhem. And there's even the ritual of the children throwing the paper into the air. I'm not sure they know why they do that. They just do. But at this moment in my own development, I had begun to teach at Bucks County Community College. I'd been teaching for 4 years in Ohio, and I'd figured this thing out with making a circle on an 8x10 film. And I was very reluctant to reveal pictures in that format at the time I first made them. Even though it was the absolute nature of the lens to form a circle, it somehow seemed a fetish or a trick or a device, not somehow authentic. I was just misunderstanding the terms of my experience. And eventually I realized how authentic that was, and that a circle was already a very powerful thing. But I had gone up to Yale that year. It was the year that I reconnected with Walker Evans. And I developed this film when I was at Yale. And what I was saying to those graduate students is, if your work is coming out of your own experience, if you don't feel like you're having to invent this, rather that the world is presenting this experience to you, like the expression of Leonardo's, to always be disciples of experience. And this is how I felt. And I think I was probably a little too enthusiastic about the sense of security I felt oh, I don't worry about my work. My work will always come to me out of life itself. And the student says, that's just, you're going too far for me. That's too much. And I got the drift of what he was saying, and I a little bit drew back from the idea. And I said, okay, fair enough. I'll grant you that. How about if I tell you, if I hadn't met and married Edith Morris, you would never have heard of me. That's transference. That's putting the responsibility elsewhere. One of my dearest friends at Princeton, the film historian, P. Adam Sitney, one day I was telling him I was going to go somewhere and give a talk, and he said, oh, just tell them that if you hadn't met Edith, they would never have heard of you. And I said, P. Adams, that's not really fair. I said that first. Well, these things are just embedded in ordinary life. And at that moment, in the 60s and into the 70s, it was getting back home and with the family that made me feel that life was right on the shining point of this moment. And it was always right there, this glowing, precious moment. This was a man that I dearly loved, an uncle, one of Edith's uncles. And this is one of Edith's aunts, in a strange costume, a strange character, a costume that she must have purchased sometime in the middle of the 30s. This is 1970 when this picture's made. And this costume spends its summers at the bottom of a chest with a lot of blankets and things. This is just to show you. Well, because this is such a scary face, the adults in the family had devised a way of enacting a Christmas ritual in which they turned off all the lights inside the house, at which time Santa would appear on the outside of the house at a window ringing a bell. Totally Pavlovian. And the children would press their little faces against the glass and scream and squeal, and the younger ones would start crying. It was really terrifying, but it was loaded with suspense and uncertainty. And then Santa would leave a big package on the front porch, and it would be brought inside by the adults, and the lights would come back on. And as our boys especially got older, we would see them running around the house looking to see which uncles were missing. Our littlest grandchild, Sage, jumped into the car coming home from school the other day. He's 7 years old. And he said, Mama, I don't think I'm going to believe in God. But if it's okay, I think I will still believe in Santa Claus. Well, you get the drift of this. In a lot of ways, it's an important picture. And it was one of the other grandchildren, Fiona, who when she was about 8 or 9, had asked for a hike in the woods. And we had walked as far as the family graveyard. And 2 little children's gravestones were, I want to say, uprooted. They were sitting on top of the soil, no longer planted in the soil, because the graves had been moved, but they hadn't taken the gravestones. Something I had taken for granted all these years. But this child didn't take it for granted, and she said, wait, who are these children? And after a lifetime of revering this woman, Maggie Cooper, and thinking about her role as Santa for this larger family of children, that she must have started in 1938 or 1939, exactly at the moment that the second of her 2 children had died. She had a healthy child, but because of the Rh factor, the next 2 didn't survive. And she simply transferred the need to be the caregiver to these children to the role of Santa. I didn't finish that little bit about the boys running around I mean, you're way ahead of me, I know. They never could solve this problem because all of the uncles were always there. And they simply were stuck in a mindedness that would not allow a woman to be inside that role. Isn't that perfect? The very word perfect there. Now my button is not allowing me to forward the slides. Is that a problem? Does anybody have a solution to this problem? Is it working? No, okay. Anyhow, we've taken far too much time. There's a great scene in the opening of the PBS special on Edward Wilson where they click the clacker and start the cameras rolling. And he begins a dialogue about how once he's finished with this project, he's going to Hollywood and apply for a job as a zombie. And then he apologizes. He said, "Oh my God, I've wasted your precious time and materials of yours. Forgive me. Can I start over?" And of course, that's the way they begin the story. A great entrance. Well, I don't have so much to say about these pictures. We can come back to them in the particular during the question period if you like. There's things to move on to. The circle was a powerful experience for me. We began to travel at this time. It's a funny little story underneath this. A curator at the school where I was teaching in Ohio informed me that there was a great 17th century Dutch printmaker who had made a circular engraving of a butchering scene in the candlelight and asked me, was that where I got the idea for my picture? And of course, if it had been the case, I would have said, yes, of course. But being young, I said, oh, you must know my wife's sister. That's where I got the idea. It's a turning point in a way, but it's not a turning point because it's not a point that I could have ever anticipated or invented. I'd intended to make a different picture, and I've often reflected back on this. If I had known I was going to make this double exposure, I would have been haunted by the fact that Frederick Sommer has this beautiful image of Max Ernst, the German artist, superimposed on a stone. Now, I would never have allowed myself I don't know the adjective I want, the luxury of making such a picture. And it was only after I discussed it with him later that I realized that his picture had also been a complete accident. He'd made a picture of Max Ernst and something was wrong with it. He'd thrown it over in the corner of the dark room. A year later, he'd made a second picture. Something was wrong with that. He'd set it over in the same corner of the dark room. Several months later, cleaning the darkroom on a not very busy day, picked up those two films at once and held them to the light and realized these two pictures, not one at a time, but together, made the picture. In this sequence, I left out the plain picture. There was an absolutely plain photograph, not the double exposure. We can come back to it. The levels of chance involved with making almost every really important thing. It's just, when I heard Frederick Sommer say, only chance is fair, I thought, boy, do I know how true that is. There's a story about that too, but you can't tell a story for everything. In the 70s, 75 in particular, I was in a transitional time. members of the family, not only the grandmother, Renee Bohr, had died, but two of her oldest sons and the last remaining males inside a matriarchal clan. And I realized that if I had developed an identity as someone who photographed the family, that was something I would also have to end, that I would have to give up. And we began to travel in Europe. Many examples lie behind these pictures. But always the coincidence, the coming together of unseen factors. Students who shared our apartment in Florence that year that we lived in Italy were from this town in southern Italy. And after they had sung the praises of the town for weeks and weeks and weeks, they said, well, why don't you come home with us for Christmas? Something else was happening in transition here, not just taking as subject places that I didn't understand, couldn't really assimilate, or simply could make a picture. But I had this experience of going into the gallery from time to time with a new picture. Someone would say, oh, you're making pictures from the air now, from an airplane. And I would say, no, this is not from an airplane, it's just from a very tall hill. But wouldn't that be nice? Wouldn't that be interesting? Wouldn't that be a connection? And that connects with the work that's in the show here in Portland, the work that was done at Mount St. Helens. There's one really simple story that links to these, and it's how I got into the air over Mount St. Helens. Some of you will even remember that time period. The red zone was closed, and after days of arguing my case with the Forest Service, the answer was always no. Drove from Vancouver in Washington to Seattle out of frustration, I think. Stopped at the airport one last time, walked into the office and said, is anybody flying to Mount St. Helens? And the lady on the desk said, he's just landed. Just a minute, I'll get him for you. In Vancouver, I had just gotten 3 days of solid no's. The pilot walked up to me and I said what I was doing. I was an artist. I was working with the Seattle Arts Commission. And could I get up at Mount St. Helens? And his response was, can I refer to you as a researcher? And of course, it was language that hadn't occurred to me. But I said, well, of course, you can say researcher. He picked up a phone. He said, I have a researcher. We're leaving for the mountain right now. We'll be up there for 2.5 hours. Fine. And you think linguistics is not important. You think how you phrase yourself, how you put your case forward. Lack of information is often more useful than too much information. This is such a beautiful thing. We have a variant of this picture in the show, but this is the one that was the awakening, the opening of eyes for me. I'd seen this at the middle of the day, just one day after the mountain, which had been closed in clouds for several days, opened out to the sun. And there was this beautiful flat edge at 9,000 feet, above which everything was white and snow, and below which absolutely demarking the freezing barrier. What a splendid thing that is, and how splendidly nature shows itself, displays what is the reality. There's a hidden secret behind the reality. And this was like that in another way, and I don't think I would have known exactly what I was seeing if I hadn't seen it a couple evenings later. The same spot, but after the ground, the glacier, the volcanic ash had frozen again, and the soil had all gone back to equal gray. It was only then that I realized that every day this mountain, its newly forming glaciers, would melt around the periphery of the glacier, the ground or the ash would saturate with water and turn black. And they would be like that for a few hours, and then as the ash would freeze again, turn back into this uniform gray. I still feel this Gaia sense of the mountain like a flower opening and closing on a daily basis. I've probably said way too much about luck, but you'll find this remarkable, I think, that in my first class at Princeton that spring was a student who would later marry King Hussein of Jordan, who would call me while I was at Mount St. Helens in 1982 and say, would you like to come to Jordan? We're having an arts festival. And, oh, you might want to bring your camera because there's maybe something interesting. You can't plan for that. Later, I realized that in the back of my father's Bible, my father was a Methodist minister. He was very much Wesleyan, end of the sort of latter day of the Great Awakening, which followed the Civil War, a need to get right with God. But in the back of his Bible, this is all just postscript, was this little wood engraving of the Kesna from the Sikh, a famous monument in Jordan. And I went thinking, oh, I won't take any pictures of archaeological sites. That's just not what I do. That lasted about 2 minutes. But I never want to talk about work technically, but I will say, and you can just note it in your own mind, there's the appearance of a kind of color at this point. And it was the beauty of the red stone itself and the beauty of the sunlight and the way the stone would change color as the night would come on and the stone would redden deeper, deeper, deeper. That a sense of color became important to me. All of which linked to a great hero of mine, the 17th century Dutch printmaker Hercules Segers. But none of that can you figure that out in advance. This is one of those hallmark things, a note to myself, when you see this again, make another negative because there's a problem with the first negative. 5 years later, I walked around the corner where I would face this stone, and simply it was gone. This was a monastic village in the 1st century AD. The Jews who converted to Christianity had fled Jerusalem and into the Anatolian desert, and they'd occupied these cells. And it's a precious and spectacular reminder. Don't put off anything you should do on the principle that something just like it will happen soon in the future. It's just not going to happen. So don't put anything off. This is another turning point and a key in this show. It's the Hanford Reservation. Mount St. Helens was in a weather situation I could sit down at the base of the mountain, which I did for several days until I just got tired of sitting there in the rain. And I drove over to Yakima. And I thought, surely it will be forbidden. I won't be able to fly over the Hanford Reservation. I knew something about it because a professor at Princeton had tried to enlist my services as photographer for something to do with Northwest Coast Consortium, the Indians whose land had been converted into Hanford. And something beautiful happened the day I was there. It was dark like this. We're looking at this ghost of a city, and all of a sudden the sun broke through. And it was like the makings of an Emily Dickinson poem. Something about the sun does not care what we do to this earth. And a misunderstanding. Misunderstanding is almost as good as a mistake. It's a kind of personal improvement on mistake. I thought leaving Portland that year that I had seen a missile silo in eastern Oregon. There's no such thing. But I didn't know that then, and I went back to the university and I started researching missile silos of North America. And it wasn't at the university I found the maps, but private individuals in North Dakota and South Dakota that had gone out on the weekend and mapped the location of all the missile silos on the high plains. It's an actual ICBM silo. It's a day that's gone, but the dilemma nor the mentality is totally gone from us. Joyriding in the Utah Basin, the very peripheral edge of the Great Salt Lake. There are some earth artists who've made important works involving aerial or out of this world points of view. It's an aeration pond for a paper mill. It's a water treatment, the water that's used to make paper. This particular mill is at Georgetown in South Carolina. Uses something on the order of 80 million gallons of water a day, which becomes so toxic that it has to be treated biologically and with sunlight and air before it's safe to return it to the system from which it was drawn, which is a huge dilemma. Anyhow, thinking that I had seen a missile silo, I started to think of that and to look for signs of the nuclear age that I knew I was a part of. That I had memories of it from my childhood, but shadow memories. Trailer park on the edge of the San Carlos Apache Reservation in Arizona. Things that has actually nothing nuclear or military to do with it. It's simply, it's a little bit like an adage that Sommer laid on me once. We were looking at Chinese paintings together in a museum, and I walked ahead just a little bit. Maybe I didn't look at these paintings long enough. And his callback, or he raced ahead to catch up with me, and he said, don't let anyone ever talk you out of physical splendor. What a thought. These are agricultural pivots. It's something that's still a book in the back of my mind, something I might even, I've stopped photographing from the air, but then as soon as you get in an airplane, you start seeing things again. I'm not sure how our time is doing. We're really on, I'm looking now for the first time. We're on the hour. If there's time in the question answer period, I can steal a moment, I'll come back to this. I'll just say what it is. It's a wheat field, which is growing on top of broken strata, so that everywhere the rock is split open, the wheat has grown a few inches taller. And an extreme slant of light, it's showing a subsurface condition is being reflected in the growth of plants above the surface. This is a hidden likeness. This is a beautiful phenomenon. And there are ideas to connect with this. This is a Nevada test site where young people waited for the bomb to go off and then got up and walked down to ground zero, which of course was radioactive. This is just a kind of intimation of that encounter and experience. You can see it better in the show than I can show it to you here, but I will say about it as I go through the slides quickly. That experience was at first a jubilation, a euphoria, until it spilled over into the deepest sadness I've ever known. But that sadness, and there's an idea here that I really like, the commonality between beauty and terror. William Blake says, without contraries, there is no progress. Without the conflict between our feelings of protectiveness and care for the beautiful and our discomfort at terror. But there's another kind of beauty too, and there's the kind of beauty that I see in this, and it's the beauty of the way things really are. It's what James Agee said, the cruel radiance of what is. Things not as you wish they were, but as they actually are. And coming face to that and changing your perception, changing your point of view, because you have experienced the evidence of the thing itself. For me, that is one of the deepest beauties. So this is a beauty we all get. We all treasure this. But it's a refinement to this treasure that we look for. We look for it both intellectually and practically. So when Sommer says it's what you do every day in the simplest way that counts, it's really true. It's not the creator who's trashing this world. It's ordinary human beings just like us. Wendell Berry says there are not enough creators to ruin the world. It depends on ordinary citizens like ourselves. This is, again, something we could come back to. But that sadness of the Nevada test site opened out into something that's still very meaningful for me. And I'm just going to show you quickly the hint of it. Going to get an education about tropical biology. I started to just search for biologists within the university where I was, and I found myself reading tropical biology. This was one of the cardinal things, but I could come back to it. And even though I'd gone trying to learn something about tropical biology, I found myself making these little cutouts of Edith, which I would take with me, or I'd bring things home from the tropics, which would turn into Edith pictures. But what I had hoped to do gradually was to synthesize in some way my own relationship to the tropics. And I probably was in the back of my mind citing scripture. There's that great passage, where store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor dust doth corrupt, nor thieves break in and steal. I love the moth getting the blunt of that accusation there. Treasures in heaven where you can avoid moths. I think that's great. One of our joys was taking these to be framed for the Smithsonian in Panama, and the framer said, "Oh, these are so beautiful. Where did you do these?" And we said, "Well, Panama." They said, "Oh, it's impossible. There's nothing like this in Panama." Of course, it's exactly where it is. But when you think about it, you don't turn on the lights at night and you don't study these things. So I found my subject in moths. This is a late in life return to aerial photography. The big retrospective in Spain came with a little invitation to do some aerial photographs in Spain. And there are just two here. This is really it. This is the coda, and this is the most significant work. There isn't that much I can tell you about it, except it dates from the very first time I had a camera in my hand. After the replication of the burned tree and the young green grass. Lessons in all these things. picture from 1963 that I probably didn't print until the 80s. I had a little habit that in teaching, and I loved teaching beginning photography, and what was one of the joys was to make a first print with first-time students. And what I had a habit of doing is I would go back over my contact sheets from when I was 20, 21, and I'd find a negative that I'd never printed, and I'd print it with the students for the first time. And I could see the way the students looked at this picture, that there was something here. It was something that I had let, I was living a life with the real thing, so I didn't need that picture to convince me, well, how stupid I could look on certain moments, and and how wonderful Edith looked to me. There's a great saying that comes out of the Civil War. Shelby Foote tells of some Southern soldier marching through Pennsylvania and saying, "Have you ever seen such a beautiful land as this?" And the soldier says, "No, but it doesn't come up to home in my eyes." And in that same way, nothing will ever take the place of this woman in my mind. That graduate student that forced me into the corner got to a truth. Without Edith, you probably would never have heard of me. There's simply the core of my work, and it's the work that continues. We don't say that we make a picture every day, but there's no days in which I'm not looking. And looking counts too. I put these in at Princeton because I knew there was this sort of general sense. People will say to Edith, "We feel like we know you, but then when we actually saw you, we were so surprised because we're not like the person we thought we knew." And I went looking for living examples of that. And what amazed me going through our sort of personal family National Geographic of all our travels was that it was a constant that her children always had their hands on her in some way. I got 6 more stories, but I don't have the time to tell them. I'm going to end with this story. A few of you may have heard this story before. I don't tire of it. In fact, where I was in Kansas City just now, somebody from the audience said, "Please tell the story about your father's mother." And of course, I knew what it was. My father and I had a special relationship, not made any less complex by the fact that for 15 years as a photographer, and this is the photographer that my parents wanted to become a minister like my father and my grandfather had been, and I just knew that wasn't in my life to be that. But I'd gotten an invitation from a theological seminary just as I'd begun at Princeton. And my father, of all people, said, "Well, look, I looked at the pictures and I survived. Send them the pictures." And I said, "Dad, you know it's going to be serious trouble if this theological seminary puts my pictures up during Parents' Week. Are we going to be in trouble?" And my father is sitting there saying, "Just do it. Just do it. Do it for your father." Well, I don't know if he was thinking about this picture when he said it. and no one will know what he was thinking. But the morning that the big package came from the seminary saying that they had taken the show down, everything was still in perfect condition, but in order to not offend the parents, they'd taken the show down. My father's processing this, and he said, "Did you write back?" And I said, "Yes, I wrote back." "What did you tell them?" I said, "I quoted to them the story of the woman taken in adultery. Christ writes in the sand, 'Whoever is without sin, cast the first stone.'" My father grinned a little grin. He said, "That was good." And then he went into a kind of trance, a sort of space travel. I had seen very few times come across his face, and he seemed to be somewhere else, sitting right there where I could see him, and yet at a distance. And I don't know if you've ever caught this in people's countenance, but from my way of thinking, the trick is you just stare at them and don't say anything. And I stared and I stared, and I finally said, "What is it?" He said, "I oughtn't to tell you." That's a backwoods terminology, oughtn't to tell you. This is full of backwoods terminology. In fact, I told it recently to some Japanese students, and you've never seen more blank faces. He's saying, he's looking at me, he says, "It reminds me of something from my childhood, but I oughtn't to tell you." Okay. And he said, well, he made the little gesture with his fingers. He said, "You know the picture you have of Edith in the barn?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, one day my mother was up in the tobacco barn, passing up sticks with tobacco threaded on each stick. They went up in the barn to dry, to cure. And all of a sudden, a neighbor who was on the ground passing up tobacco looks up in the barn and says, 'My God, Martha, you ain't got on no bloomers.'" Bloomers is an old term for underwear for you young and uninitiated. "My God, Martha, you ain't got on no bloomers. You're going to show these men folk down here everything you got." To which my father's mother called back down, "You see anything up here the Lord didn't make, you sick the dog on it." Thank you. Yeah. I'm over. Do you want to just drop the questions? She's saying no. You got somewhere to go, you just go. If you want to stay and ask a question, I'm happy to spend this 15 minutes answering questions. Are you going to facilitate these questions, Julia? Or is somebody going to?
That's a great question.
You want my opinion? There aren't any questions. I've told you everything you need to know.
I am demonstrating. If you have a question, please come up to the microphone so that everyone can hear your question. Thanks.
I'm going to come down. Can I move around? I'm going to come down to where you are. So we'll be right here.
What a treat. How has the digital age changed photography for you?
You got that. How has the digital age changed photography? I have a kind of standard answer for that, which is my standard experience. I don't know when you think the digital age began, but I remember opening a Smithsonian in 1976 and seeing an image where a Civil War photograph, which had bleached because it was so poorly washed that the fixer had completely whitened the entire image. NASA technology was used to scan the print. Mathematical equations were used to stretch out the tonalities of that very faint image and create a 19th century quality high contrast negative, which was then turned into an albumin print. That for me was the moment the digital age arrived. Our memories of seeing images come back to us from the moon was another moment in which the digital age arrived. My grandfather, my father's father, when we would see him every Christmas on the farm near Appomattox Courthouse, 5 miles from where Lee surrendered. He'd get my father or me, one of us, and he would corner my father, and he would say something that my father could absolutely not tolerate, and yet it was his father, so he had to. And so he would say something racial or something about women or something, and my father would just have to sit on his hands and say, whatever it is you say to placate a father who's too contrary, too mean-spirited, and just beyond saving. But I remember this in this context, the grandfather saying to me one day, he said, Emmett, William, tell me the truth now. They made those pictures that's supposed to be the moon. They made those in Arizona now, didn't they? You know they did. A personal note, so there's responding to this digital thing. I had used film in Panama and Costa Rica, Ecuador, for about 5 years. I probably, using transparency film, made 300 or 400 rolls of film, and I had one grid of 25 pictures to show for it. It had taken 5 years. I switched to digital, and on the week I switched to digital, I had another grid. And this project, which I think of as a kind of biology primer, sacred planet book that would interest both scientists and children equally. It's like a guide to biodiversity. It has 1,200 species in it. I no more could have gotten to 1,200 species without digital camera so that I could see the results, because everything I'm photographing is an alive insect. And they tend to fly off or walk off or roll over on the backs or stick their tails up in the air and do pernicious things. They're just difficult. And digital lets you solve the problem. You know when things are wrong. You know when the light isn't right. You can make an adjustment. And it's nothing to take sitting. I think of them like grade school children having the portrait taken. And I just got a dose of that because the little Violet, the people taking the school pictures had told her to put her hand on her hip and do the little gesture. And she did it, but you could see on her face this absolute disgust. What a stupid man making us do this. Okay, so we're in the digital age. Yeah, I see a hand, and then I think that should be it. You're gonna, okay. Come on. No, I'll take 2 questions.
Would you talk about Robert Frank's work and how it might have influenced you?
Did you get the question? Can I talk about Robert Frank and how it influenced me? 2 things I would like to have told, but I just simply forgot. One of the people in a drawing class, within the first 2 or 3 weeks of art school, I'd listen to classmates say, "Oh, do you realize we have to take a photography class? What a waste of time." I'd had this experience which sort of galvanized me and made me think, no, a photograph can be transcendent. It isn't just what the picture is of. It's a feeling. It's something beyond words. So I was already tuned in. And a student who was really good at drawing brought in The Family of Man, and I always felt like he brought it in and he put it in front of me like, would you calm down and not be so excited? Just ease up. And I started looking through it, and so many pages in, I saw several things of great interest to me. But maybe 40 pages later, I found another picture with exactly the same feeling. And I thought, I'm going to check. And I looked at the name under the photograph, and the name was Robert Frank. When I got back 40 pages before, the name under that photograph was also Robert Frank. So that set in place for me a recognition that the picture was in Robert before the picture was made. The feeling which Robert found in the world at large already inhabited Robert Frank. It gave me unbelievable confidence. And because I had, in a sense, run a scientific experiment, I had run it blind. I didn't know whose name I was going to find. When I got back to that second Robert Frank name under the picture, I said, and you get it. You know how that picture feels. If you know the feeling of picture, you're already below the surface. You're mining the depth of that picture. There was one other question. I don't know if that does Robert Frank, but I tried to salute Frank by showing the cover of the Saul Steinberg version, the French edition of the Americans. Oh, yeah.
1965, after 20 weeks with Bruce Davies, I was a professional photography student. Could I get closer?
No, just say it. I'll repeat what I need.
I was with Bruce for 20 weeks, along with 10 other students, and he said to me, I think you should go to David Vestal now. It's time for you to go to David. So I went over there, and very different kind of guy. You'd be in his apartment until 3 in the morning. And the way he did it was to tell you to bring pictures in, and he'd comment on them. So one day, not long after I started, somebody said, talk about Callahan. And he said, poor Eleanor. And I want you to explain why he said that.
I'm not so sure I can repeat that question. I'm not even sure my mother would approve. Why would David Vestal have been worried about Eleanor's welfare? I have a story for you. Not the answer to your question, but a story. I've been thinking this of late. I think I must have taken storytelling with Abraham Lincoln in grade school somewhere. Oh no, God, I went and forgot what I wanted to say. Oh yes, got it back. Just like that. It's gone, then it's back. David Vestal was worried about Eleanor Callahan being used unfairly through the exposure of her nakedness before the world. Well, one night at a dinner party, I heard a woman across the table from where I was sitting say to somebody, and I wasn't particularly looking up, but I realized as I heard these words that it was Edith, my wife, that she was talking to, and she said, so, you're the infamous Edith. If you don't mind me saying so, these pictures are just too personal. And now I don't dare look. I'm just burying my head like this, and I'm just waiting in suspense for what. And I hear the voice on the other side of the table. Edith said, I really don't know what pictures you've seen, but the pictures that are too personal, we don't show to anyone. Thank you.